Welcome, everyone, to our third installment of our online Monday training sessions. For those of you joining us again, welcome back. For those of you joining us for the first time from other divisions, welcome. We hope to see you here for the next few weeks as we continue these training sessions. Tonight, we will be hearing from Nick Hume, but I'll let him introduce his presentation. Before we start, I'll introduce myself. My name is Anna. I currently serve as the DS at Division 176 in Victoria. When I'm not at St. John, I work for the ambulance service as a paramedic, and I've kind of been overseeing these online training sessions. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping before we start so everyone's kind of on the same page about how this works. So during Nick's talk, if you have a question that comes up, if you look at the bottom of your screen somewhere down here, there is a chat function. Pop your questions in there. I'll be monitoring that chat box and writing questions down. After Nick's talk, there'll be a question and answer period where he'll address anything that comes up. And at that point, we can unmute everybody's mics and we can have a discussion if you'd like. Down in the sort of, on my screen, right-hand side, there's a little hand wave. If you want to put up your hand or whatever, we can do that, or just unmute yourself and ask your questions. For the duration of the presentation, I'll keep you guys muted with your cameras off. Just so that we only hear Nick and the background noise in Nick's office. But other than that, here we go. Here's Nick.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna. So welcome, everyone. I understand we've got some folks from a few different divisions around the province tonight. I see I've already seen at least a couple people from 518, and now we've got folks from up and down the island, so welcome, everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about the history of the most venerable order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. And I have to emphasize, I titled this a brief history. I have to emphasize how brief this is. You could probably pick any 10 or 20 year period of this history and find someone who's done a PhD on it. So we really are going to move fairly quickly through a lot of stuff. As Anna said, if you've got questions, please just type them into chat. I'm not going to be monitoring chat myself, but Anna will be, as I try to close the chat window here, actually, so I don't have to look at it. Anna will be, and she'll be keeping the questions until the end. If there's anything really urgent that like is sort of fundamental to your understanding, maybe try and make that obvious. And if Anna needs to interrupt me, she can. But I'd sort of like to try and get towards the end of the presentation before we start jumping around too much with questions and queries. So a little bit about who I am. My name is Nick. I'm a paramedic with the BC Ambulance Service or BC Emergency Health Services. I'm based in Victoria. I have an academic background in anthropology. Technically, I've studied, or I have a degree in archaeology and osteoforensics. I've also spent time studying at Camosun College, which is our local college here. University of California, Los Angeles, University College London, and Thompson Rivers. So I am a bit of an academic nerd. I'm a St. John member in Victoria. I'm technically a provincial staff officer, but I do the vast majority of my work with Division 176, and I have a bit of an interest in the organization and the Order of St. John itself. What I'm not is I'm not an academically qualified historian. So if any of you are looking at this and thinking, wow, this guy doesn't seem like he's a real historian, I'm not. I'm a St. John nerd who reads this stuff for fun in my spare time. But I do have a bit of a background in historically stuff, and I'd like to think I can put together some reasonable presentation for you guys. So a couple of brief notes. These are sort of academic housekeeping notes. Dates throughout this presentation are all in BCE and CE, so that's before current era and after the current era. Those of you that are familiar with BC and AD, before Christ and Anno Domini annotations, they basically mean the same thing. BCE and CE are really just a way of recognizing those dates and also being respectful. People don't happen to be Christian or of the Christian faith. There is a lot of conflicting information about the history of the order, and I've done my very best to try and acknowledge it when there's conflicting information, and to try and pull out the most likely to be accurate versions of things. But it's important to remember that a lot of this stuff happened many, many hundreds of years ago, and sometimes the history books get a little bit muddled. We'll talk about that very early as we get into some of this stuff. Also important to remember that history is written by the victors. Where possible, I've tried to look at sources or recognize secondary sources that have looked at primary sources from both sides of a conflict. Clearly, the Order of St. John is still here nearly 1,000 years later, so a lot of the history written by us has been de facto written by the victors. I don't think there's anything hugely misleading, and again, I try to address it when there's stuff that's a little bit questionable. Discussion of history directly tied to any particular religion doesn't imply endorsement of that religion. That means that we're talking a lot about Christian and Muslim faith conflict. That doesn't mean that I'm endorsing or not endorsing either side of that. I do not happen to belong to either of those religions, but I still like to be able to talk about them, and they've obviously had a big impact on us. Any errors in this should be presumed to be mine. There's a lot of content in here. If anything's screwed up, there's a very good chance that I'm the one that got it wrong, not the historians and authors that I've relied on. And there are like 8 slides worth of references at the end of this that I will just slowly scroll through for anyone looking at the recordings of this who wants to go do more of their work later. I didn't make it super obvious in each slide. A huge amount of the graphics for this come from public domain images, and those are all cited at the end, even if I didn't actually get the citation into the slide. So we've tried to break this into really sort of 6 fairly discrete sections, and then move fairly quickly. Before the beginning, so before the Order of St. John was really a thing, and sort of what laid the groundwork for it. Our early years in Jerusalem and the Levant, our time in Cyprus and Rhodes, our time in Malta, the sort of defeat and exile of the order from Malta, and then what we're doing today. Really, since the British Order was founded in 1888 or 1831. We'll talk about that as well. I have not gone too far down the rabbit hole of what the other orders of St. John are doing, but again, we'll talk about that. So before the beginning, before 1099 CE, 1099 is the year that's often recognized as the foundation or the first year that the order was recognized. And we were founded, as most of you guys can probably guess from our name, the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. We were founded in Jerusalem. For anyone who isn't familiar with Jerusalem, it's an ancient city. And by ancient, I mean many thousands of years, of great importance to 3 of the world's largest religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And for a whole bunch of reasons we're not going to go into tonight, those 3 groups in particular have been fighting over it in various forms for well over 2,000 years. Jerusalem's been reconquered many times by different religious groups, and we're not going to go into all that. I'm not a Crusades historian. I'm not a historian at all. I'm not a Crusades historian. So we're not going to go into all the nitty-gritty of the back and forth. I do, though, want you guys to see a map of what is the old city of Jerusalem to appreciate how small a space this really is. There's only about a 2.5 kilometer by 2.5 kilometer square of land in what is now Israel and Palestine, and it's really important to understand how tightly packed all this stuff is. So I'm going to point out a couple of big landmarks here, just again to get you guys on the right page here. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the blue star is, that's where Jesus was both killed and where the empty tomb was, and where his empty tomb still is. And less than 400 meters away is the Temple Mount, the Temple of Solomon, the most holy site in Judaism, and Islam, and really important for the Christians as well. And then about 200 meters, not even away from the tomb of Christ, is the Moristan Hospital District and the First Hospital of St. John. This is literally, I was lucky enough to be there about 3.5 years ago. And you could literally walk from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the hospital in less time than I've been talking at you guys this evening. They're literally next door to each other. So going back way before the beginning. So the first, actually, I should have kept this up. The very first hospital that was built in Jerusalem, and there's a bunch of this is where the sorry, it's my first time running this presentation, so I'm still getting used to where all the stars pop up. Where the black star is where the hospital currently is, and the very first hospital that was built there was built by this guy named Judas Maccabeus, otherwise known as Judas the Hammer, who was a Judean priest and led the reconquest of Jerusalem by the Jews in 167 to 160 BCE, so 160 years before the time of Christ. His victory and in conquering Jerusalem and the return of Jewish prayer at the Temple of Solomon, is still celebrated today as Hanukkah. He also, among other things, built the first hospital in the Moristan district. So the very first hospital on the site of what is now the Hospital of St. John has been there for just over 2,200 years. This was not a hospital of St. John, but it was the earliest reference that we have to healthcare being provided on the site. As legend goes, Judas Maccabeus handed control of the hospital over to Zachary, who was the father of St. John the Baptist, which may or may not be true and may or may not be related to where the St. John nomenclature that we use today comes from. First hospital, 2,200 years ago. Yes. Sometime later, this guy, Pope Gregory, that's probably bad to say Pope Greg. Pope Gregory is the Pope from about 590 to 604 of the Common Era. Sometime around 600, he dispatched a guy named the Abbot Probus to establish a Christian hospital in Jerusalem. Keep in mind, Judas Maccabeus, Jewish guy. We don't want a Jewish hospital there. We want a Christian hospital there. So Pope Gregory I sent the Abbot Probus to establish a Christian, or specifically a Catholic, hospital in Jerusalem. And to the best of our knowledge, that hospital was also built in the Moristan district. It might have been built on the same site as Judas Maccabeus' hospital. It might have been built adjacent to it. Maccabeus' hospital might have been destroyed. I don't have an answer to that question. But Pope Gregory I did send the Abbot Probus to go and build a hospital there around 600 CE. The hospital ended up being enlarged by the Emperor Charlemagne and becoming a fairly significant healthcare facility in its own right, until the Caliph al-Hakim of the sixth Fatimid Caliph, pardon me, in around the year 1010, about 400 years later, invaded and successfully conquered Jerusalem and ordered the destruction of the Christian churches, temples, and the other institutions, including the hospital. Now, there's some debate about whether he actually destroyed the hospital or whether he diminished the hospital, or oh, I'm getting a note to be more gentle with my spacebar. I will try to be gentle with my spacebar. Whether al-Hakim actually destroyed the hospital or just damaged it or repurposed it or something. But there was significant damage to the hospital, may or may not have ceased to function. Fast forward another 13 years to a place called Amalfi. Amalfi is a port town on the west coast of Italy. And as many port towns around the Mediterranean were, the people who lived there were fairly wealthy. There were many merchants there. And they sponsored the rebuilding and restoration of the hospital so that pilgrims would have a place to rest, and also so that businessmen from Amalfi, wealthy merchants, would have a place to go to stay. And it's important to remember as well in this context that at the time, a hospital, or sometimes called a hospice, or sometimes called a xenodochium, as the Greeks would say, was often a place of rest where one would go and stay and reside and also receive healthcare while you were staying and residing there. And the lines between those things were not as clearly delineated as they are today, with the difference between hospitals and hotels. It's sort of a dual purpose facility. But anyway, in 1023, we're quite sure that wealthy merchants from Amalfi sponsored the rebuilding of the hospital. Now, it's important to note as well that at the time, in 1023, Jerusalem was still under the control of the Muslims, and specifically the Caliph, I should say Caliph, not Caliph, the Caliph al-Zahir. There are some indications, and I've read a couple of sources that I'm not quite clear on, that Ali az-Zahir might have actually given the land to the wealthy merchants of Amalfi, not just given permission for them to do this, might have actually given it to them to help promote trade. You want your business partners to have a comfortable place. And so in the way that we still, today schmooze business partners, there's some indications that that might have happened or might not. Again, lots of blurred lines here. What we do know is that in 1023, this is a picture of modern Amalfi, by the way. This is literally from Wikipedia, but this is what Amalfi looks like today. Beautiful port town, large beaches. I'd love to go sometime. It's supposed to be gorgeous. But in 1023, the merchants of Amalfi were directly involved in creating or recreating the hospital. So fast forward another 80 years or so, and we find that the guy who's running the hospital is someone named Gerard. It's come to be known later as the Blessed Gerard. There's great conflict in the sources as to when exactly he started operating and controlling the hospital. 1080 seems to be the most reasonable date. Some sources say he started controlling the hospital in 1023 when the merchants of Amalfi actually first rebuilt it. We'll talk in a second about why that seems to be very unlikely. But this guy Gerard was in charge around 1080 or so, starting around 1080. It's important to note this is this ink line drawing of him. You see him with a white Maltese cross, the cross of St. John, Maltese cross on his chest. This drawing would have been done, I don't actually have a date on it, but sometime after the 1600s or so. That white cross wasn't actually something that was adopted by the order until 15 or 1600, but because many later artists associated it with St. John, they also often put it on drawings of people who were present before that time. So it's probably not an accurate representation. And we could also pay attention to the robes or the cloth or clothing that Gerard is wearing in this drawing. You'll notice that he's wearing a very monastic sort of robe, and we'll come back to that in a second. Gerard was a Benedictine monk. I'm not a deeply religious person. I don't know too much about the Benedictine order, other than that I believe they're fairly service-oriented, which is consistent with what we know about Gerard. One of the interesting things about Gerard is that in 1080, the city of Jerusalem was still controlled by the Islamic faith, by the Caliph. And despite this, Gerard, as a Benedictine Christian monk, was allowed to remain in the city and operate the hospital while the city was still under Islamic rule. And there's very few reasons that I can think of, and certainly the other historians I've read can think of, as to why this might have been the case. And one of the most compelling versions or compelling theories to me is that Gerard had a reputation for providing care to anyone who needed it, whether you were Muslim or Christian or Jewish or purple or pink or whatever. If he was doing a good enough job of taking care of the local populace, they were probably willing to tolerate him taking care of the other people as well. There are some references to suggest that Gerard was harassed and at one point tortured and left crippled for his work, possibly for helping Christians who were not that popular at the time. And Gerard is known to have helped Christian troops outside the walls during the siege of Jerusalem. We're going to talk about that in a second. The supposed way, or the way that he's recorded as having helped people, is he would go, he would take donations at the hospital, he would go to the walls, and then he would use donations that had been given to the hospital to purchase bread and then throw bread over the walls to Christians who were laying siege to the city. And apparently, ostensibly, at one point, the caliph's guards found Gerard doing this and dragged him before the caliph to have him put to death. And supposedly, if you want to believe the legends, Gerard performed a miracle by turning all of the bread into stones, and when they emptied his pockets to see the loaves of bread that he'd been throwing over the walls, all they found were rocks. I think it's far more likely that Gerard just happened to have thrown the last loaf of bread before they caught him, but what can you do? This happened almost 1,000 years ago, so it's a little bit hard to tell. Gerard died on September 3rd, 1120. And the reason we think it's unlikely that Gerard was involved in the construction of the hospital in 1023 is that he would have either been 97 years old and a 1-week-old newborn, or he just didn't have anything to do with the foundation of the hospital in 1023. We were pretty sure about the date of his death. As you can see from his epitaph, he was very highly regarded, the humblest man in the East, the servant of the poor, hospitable to strangers, meek of countenance, but with a noble heart. One can see in these walls how good he was. This is his epitaph from the hospital in Jerusalem. Yeah, I don't have too much else to say about that, but he was clearly a very, very highly regarded man. And the fact that we're still doing his work 1,000 years later, 900 years later, is I think a significant testament to the type of work he did. So going back again, 1080, Gerard is involved organizing this hospital, or leading, or being the rector, the warden of the hospital. And then in 1099, the Christians come back. The Christians come back to try and conquer Jerusalem. And this is when Gerard was throwing bread over the walls to the besieging army and all this sort of thing. The siege of Jerusalem, again, I'm not going to go too far into this. It wasn't very long. It lasted about 5 weeks. The siege of Jerusalem was notable for a few things. It was noted for the vicious and wholesale slaughter of the Jews and the Muslims in the population by the Christians. They put the entire city to the sword. There's very clear stories that men, women, children, invalids, anybody who couldn't run fast enough was fairly ruthlessly murdered. This is an important day for us because it represents the beginning of an era in which Gerard's hospital existed within what you could think of as a friendly political administration. So previously the hospital's been operating in a hostile environment. They're tolerating his presence, but he's not really a welcome visitor. They're sort of willing to tolerate him because he's helping everyone, but he's a Christian. We don't like them. And so he didn't really get a lot of support. What happened after 1099 was really significant. So post-Crusade, one of the first things that happened, of course, is that as the Crusaders returned home after reconquering Jerusalem, they went back to all of their home countries, to Italy, to France, to England, to wherever else they were, sort of throughout the old empire, and spoke very highly of the work of the hospital and its leader Gerard. They talked very openly about how much good had been done by this man and this hospital that he was running. And keep in mind as well that many of these crusaders would have been noble knights, noble families, people with significant means and money who had been directly helped by the hospital. And as a result, donations started to flow in from philanthropists and people who wanted to support the hospital. Very, very quickly, in the space of a decade or two, secondary hospitals were established throughout the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Middle East, as well as across Italy and other parts of Christendom. By the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a couple hundred years later, there were estates and hospitals in dozens and dozens and dozens of places across the entire Christian realm, really directly as a result of the good work that was being done by Gerard and the way he was telling people about it. As an example, this dates from around 1204, so only 5 years after 105 years after the 1099 conquest of Jerusalem. But within a century, we've already seen orders of nuns of St. John springing up in a number of places. This is a sister of the order who was based in England, I believe. I'm clearly a drawing of, but so the hospital is becoming famous. It's getting lots of money. Very shortly afterwards, in 1113, so 14 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, the Pope's starting to pay attention now. And Pope Pius II issues a papal bull, a papal order called Pia Postulatio Voluntatis. And if I'm butchering the pronunciation of this, I apologize. And what Pia Postulatio Voluntatis means, or said, was it granted the order of the hospital a formal status. It granted it immunity from tithes, or taxes, to the church, and it granted it the right to self-govern independently of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that's a huge deal. This document, and I've actually seen the original of this document, it's still in the Great Library of Malta. But this document effectively established the order of the hospital as an independent organization that was not beholden to the kings of any particular country. It was beholden only to God and to the Catholic faith and to God's representative on earth, which was the Pope. So really, the only person who could tell the order of the hospital what to do anymore was the Pope himself. Gerard died a few years later in 1120. He gave up control of the hospital a few years before he died. Some people say 1116, 17, somewhere in there. And he gave up control, and the second rector or warden of the hospital is a guy named Raymond Dupuy. And I want you guys to pay attention to what Raymond Dupuy is wearing in this drawing of him as well. You'll notice that he's wearing heavy plate armor, which should tell you something about what he did with our fine organization 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago. So Raymond was the successor to Gerard. In 1119, he took over. He oversaw the expansion of the hospital in a protective organization. And what a protective organization means is that there was a very strong argument, and it actually is to some extent practical, that they said, well, look, why are we bothering to like shelter everyone and provide them care if they're all getting murdered on the road to Jerusalem? We should be sending armed groups out to protect people on the road. From all of the muggers, murderers, heathen, non-Christian hordes, whoever, before they get here. Never mind that that was a bit of a deviation from the we'll care for everyone who comes to our doorstep ethos that had been brought forward and supported by Gerard. They made a good argument that, or not a good argument, they made an argument that it made more sense to be proactive, and began to militarize the order. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a quick map here. I'm sorry, I don't think I can make a pointer work on this presentation, but I want everyone to just see really fast, because we're going to delve into a little bit of Exodus here, where Jerusalem is, where Acre is. The city of Acre was one of the Crusader strongholds. It was located just north of where Haifa is now. It's about where the F in Haifa is. I want you to pay attention to where Cyprus is and where Rhodes is, because we're going to start talking about those in a second as well. So fast forward another 90 years and a few grand masters of the order, and the order of the hospital is still providing hospital services. It's still providing a hospice. It's now got dozens of out hospitals and extra hospitals and hospices all around Christendom, in Acre, in Cyprus, in what is now the UK and the rest of Europe. And the local Muslim population started to get a little bit fed up with all the Christians running around in the Holy Land. They want it back. And there's a large battle called the Battle of Hattin, which happened in a place called the Horns of Hattin, which it's about where the E in West Bank is. If you see where West Bank is in between Jerusalem and Acre there, Hattin's about where the E is. So the Battle of Hattin took place in 1187, and it was an absolutely catastrophic defeat for the Christians in the Holy Land. They were absolutely wiped out. It completely removed the Catholic Church's ability to effectively wage war and wage crusades in that part of the world. The reasons for that are quite interesting. The short version is that very poor command overexerted the troops before combat, made them march for 2 days through a desert with no water, with their horses and some of their weaker men just dropping dead during the march. And then they were surprised when they weren't effective in combat afterwards. The Battle of Hattin, we're not going to talk about this, but this did trigger the Third Crusade to retake the Holy Land, which clearly did not have a great effect. The most important thing about the Battle of Hattin is this really marked the turning point for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So what was the Kingdom of Jerusalem? The Holy Land never recovered after the Battle of Hattin. Things just started going downhill and getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And the Christians started slowly losing ground and losing ground and losing ground, and were eventually forced back all the way to Acre. And Acre was the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land in 1291. Now, in 1291, the fall of Acre happened, the siege of Acre, and subsequently the fall of Acre. The fall happened after the siege. Acre was the last Crusader stronghold in the kingdom. It was the absolute last stand. At the time, a Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, who were still building hospitals, still had a hospital in Acre. I have gone and stood in the hospital hall in Acre. It's incredible. Was wounded during the siege of Acre. He did survive, and he was successfully evacuated. The defeated Acre effectively ended the Kingdom of Jerusalem and effectively ended the Christian presence in the Holy Land. And the Knights Hospitaller were driven back to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus was not the most ideal place for them to be, but it was a place for them to be. So we'll talk a little bit about Cyprus itself really fast. So by 1291, they're driven out of the Holy Land. By 1296, they've already started building their first new hospital in a place called Limassol. Limassol's on the south coast of Cyprus. I don't have a map for you, I'm sorry. It's almost directly in the middle on the south coast. By about 5 years after that, the order was the order of the hospital was, by its nature, because all these donations were flowing in from all these different places. The Order of the Hospital was a really international organization. And 1301 was when they first started to organize themselves into longs or tongues and separate into different groups the people who were speaking different languages. Now, I'm not sure why that didn't happen earlier, but I would suspect that previously they might have actually had enough facilities around the Holy Land to be able to send all the French speakers to one place and all the Spanish speakers to another place. They didn't really have to do this, but once they were actually building the hospital in Limassol and existing in Cyprus, a very enclosed space. And so what we ended up with is 7 longs or divisions within the order: Provence, Auvergne, France, Spain, Italy, England, and Germany. I'm obviously using the modern names for these. The Long of Spain was later divided, I think 20 or 30 years later, into Castile, Portugal, and Aragon, Navarre, for a total of 8 longs. And those of you who pay attention to the 8-pointed cross, there are relatively modern, I'm not sure how modern, but relatively modern suggestions that the 8 points of the cross represent the 8 longs of the order, as well as the 8 beatitudes. That's another thing. So Cyprus served as one thing, and that was a base to build a hospital, build a fortress, rebuild an army, and with the blessing and the support and the active encouragement of the Pope at the time, to go and invade Rhodes. And so 18 years after arriving on Cyprus, the Hospitallers were encouraged to go and invade Rhodes and start building a military and a healthcare empire there. So while on Rhodes, and I'm not going to go too much into the 1309 siege of Rhodes. That's an area that I'm not especially knowledgeable. There's tons of cool history about it. It's just not something that I'm knowledgeable enough to talk in depth about that particular conflict. But, the Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, took over Rhodes by force, and really started to flourish there. They were there for another 214 years in total, and really started to develop the order's internal structure, the actual power structure, and the political structure within the order. They developed sets of rules under which the Grand Masters could be elected, and they developed their Grand Masters being what they were now calling the leaders of the organization. And they developed a very stringent and fairly high standard of what people had to have accomplished in their lives to become a Grand Master of the Order. So you had to be a knight of, and this was an elected position, by the way. This was a democracy. You were elected by the other nobles of the organization. The other knights would all vote and vote in a Grand Master. So to become a Grand Master, you have to be a Knight of Justice of the Order. And if those of you who are familiar with the organization of the Order of St. John now, you'll notice that this terminology is still here. We still have Knights of Justice and Dames of Grace. They must have spent 3 years at sea while the order was in Rhodes. The naval power of the order started to be developed very, very significantly. We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. But they must have spent 3 years at sea effectively in a combat or corsair-like role, helping steal money from everyone who wasn't Christian to give back to the church and give back to the organization, which they would then use to build hospitals and build healthcare facilities. They had to have spent 3 years in the convent. So there was a differentiation back in these days between a military order and a monastic order. And the Order of St. John, the Order of the Hospital, really towed both of those lines. We had both monastic components. So you had people who were exclusively religious brothers and sisters of the organization. And you had people who were there to go and extend the military might of the Catholic Church and do so under the auspices of the Order of the Hospital. And it's interesting to see that a Grand Master had to have spent 3 years in both of those roles to be eligible for the position of Grand Master. They had to have been in the order for a total of 13 years. They had to have 13 years of seniority as well. Earlier, I talked a little bit about how history is written by the victors and how things can be a little bit difficult to have accuracy on. And I want to really emphasize that this next slide is documented thoroughly in multiple sources as being factual. So there are multiple sources, multiple written sources from the 1300s saying that what I'm about to tell you is true. So shortly after arriving on Rhodes, a guy named Dieudonné de Gozon became aware of a dragon that lived in a local swamp very close to wherever he happened to be. I seem to recall it was on the eastern edge of the island. They'd been killing cattle belonging to farmers. Previous Grand Masters had actually ordered the knights to stay away from the dragon because so many people, presumably farmers, possibly knights, had been killed by the dragon that nobody else was to bother it or go anywhere near it. And so Dieudonné de Gozon decided that he was going to be the guy to kill the dragon. So what he did is he got a description of the dragon from the local farmers whose cows had been murdered. He built a replica of the dragon, somewhere discreet so that the Grand Master wouldn't find out about it, trained a pack of dogs to attack the dragon, and then hatched this plan that he was going to send this pack of dogs at this dragon. And then while the dragon was busy fighting the dogs, he would kill the dragon and he would become Dieudonné de Gozon. So what happened to Dieudonné de Gozon? Well, he went and killed the dragon, and he did actually kill the dragon. He brought the dragon's head back, and it was mounted on the castle gates in Rhodes until 1837, when some people who were cleaning the castle threw it out. So we don't know what it looks like, unfortunately. For disobeying the orders of the Grand Master, Dieudonné was dismissed from the order, and then because everybody was so upset that he had been dismissed for doing this great service, he was promptly reinstated. He managed to keep the name the Dragon Slayer, Dieudonné the Dragon Slayer, and 30 or 40 years later went on to become elected the Grand Master of the Order, apparently in part based on the positive public relations effect that he got from being Dieudonné the Dragon Slayer. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that this is documented in multiple written historical sources. Now, there's a bunch of possible explanations. The most likely explanation, I think, that I have seen is that Dieudonné probably went and found himself a Nile crocodile that had somehow ended up on Rhodes and was living in a swamp, and everybody thought the crocodile was a dragon, and then Dieudonné went and killed the crocodile, which is probably not that hard for an armored knight, and then brought back this ferocious creature beast thing that people were unfamiliar with and said, look, I killed a dragon, I have its skull here, and showed everyone the crocodile dragon skull, and basically ran with things from there. That's the most credible theory that I have read. Whether that's actually what happened, I don't know. Nobody knows. I'm personally very sad that the dragon skull was thrown away in 1837. I would love to have seen what it looked like. That would have been fantastically interesting. Moving on, a little bit of history in Rhodes. So while in Rhodes, the Knights of the Hospital did a few things. They spent a lot of their time developing themselves into a major military force. They became the predominant naval force in the Mediterranean for a period of about 400 years, 500 years, 400 years, 350 years, 400 years, something like that. As you can see in the picture here, you can see the gentleman with the 8-pointed Hospitaller cross steering the boat with the 8-pointed Hospitaller cross at the back. That's an older style Hospitaller cross. That is quite likely what Hospitaller crosses looked like back in this era, not the 8-pointed cross that we see now. In 1312, the Knights Templar of conspiracy theory fame were dissolved by the Catholic Church, and there's all this ethos and legend around this and stuff, but the Templars were dissolved, and the church said, okay, well, we're taking all your land. What are we going to do with it? We're going to give a whole bunch of your land and your wealth and your property and your resources to the Hospitallers because we like them more. And so the Hospitallers had this massive influx of wealth and massive influx of resources at that time. Throughout all of this, hospital work persisted. They continued to build hospitals. They continued to build hospices. They continued to build places of care and train healers and monk healers and all that throughout the Holy Land, throughout Europe, up to the United Kingdom, up to Poland, and at some point up to Russia. Certainly through France and Italy and Spain and the Eight Longs, Germany as well. The building of the hospitals and the healthcare work did seem to take a backseat for a while, starting around the 1320s, 1330s, somewhere in that neighborhood. We really started to focus much less on the hospital work and much more on the naval combat for several hundred years. So while in Rhodes, I'm not going to go way down the rabbit hole, but there were many military campaigns. There was significant naval might. There were a number of sieges. The Turkish Empire, or what is now the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates came and besieged Rhodes 3 times in 1444, 1480, and 1522. They were unsuccessful the first 2 times. They were successful and defeated Rhodes the 3rd time in 1522. Partway through that interval in 1365, the Hospitallers went and sacked the city of Alexandria because it wasn't Christian. It didn't have anything worth keeping, so they went and put it to the sword and the flame. And it's important to remember as well, we've talked about this a lot, but Rhodes was the seat of power. Operations continued in many other places, lots of other Hospitaller presence throughout the Christian world. But Rhodes was the seat of power. So this is the best image I can get you of what was at the time, the peak of advanced naval technology. This was what's called a caravel. And this ship is supposed to be a depiction of the Santa Ana. It was launched in 1522. She's actually built in Nice in France. Again, lots of Hospitaller operations in lots of places other than Rhodes. She was launched the same year that Rhodes fell in the Great Siege of Rhodes. And I've seen one source that says that she was launched the day after Rhodes fell, but nobody knew it yet because it was so far away. She had a crew capable of sailing her and using her as a combat vessel, and also carrying 500 Marines who could board other ships and take over other ships. There's some sources say that the Santa Ana, was the first ironclad. She did in fact have lead cladding below the waterline. Some people say that was to help with water tightness. Other people say that was actually armor. I don't think lead makes great armor, but I'm also not a naval architect, so you tell me. She was a pretty high-tech ship for her age. She had a forge on board, so they could actually effect metalwork repairs on board the wooden ship. The wooden ship had a forge on board. That's a pretty notable thing, or at least I think it is. Again, I'm not a naval historian. Had ovens and a mill, so they actually could mill their own flour and bake fresh bread on board. And she reputedly had a storage capacity or a cargo capacity to carry 900 tons of cargo, which again, this is not a small vessel. And while she was the peak of naval technology at the time, it's important to recognize that the Hospitallers had a very, very large fleet that they were using to control most of the marine trade in the Mediterranean at the time. There are some reports that the Santa Ana single-handedly defeated 25 enemy ships in one combat. That's not necessarily as unrealistic as one might think. For a whole bunch of reasons I'm not necessarily going to go into, but it's not necessarily a completely ridiculous number. There were, for a period of time, reports from the Islamic Caliphates, written reports from the Islamic Caliphates, that even more modest ships than the Santa Ana, the wisdom from the Caliphate was that to defeat one or to go toe-to-toe on the open ocean against one ship belonging to the Hospitallers, the Caliphate felt it necessary to send 7 of their own ships. And I'm not clear if that's because they were smaller or less well equipped or what, but there was certainly a numbers disparity there. So saying that this pinnacle of technology might have defeated 25 ships at once is maybe not completely ridiculous. In 1522, the siege of Rhodes, the caliphate decided they'd had enough. They launched their third siege in a couple hundred years. This is what we call the siege of Rhodes. There were in fact 9 sieges of Rhodes over the centuries. This is the siege of Rhodes. Some sources say that Suleiman, the Sultan Suleiman, sent 700 ships and 200,000 men to lay siege to Rhodes. The order unsuccessfully tried to defend it with 500 knights and 1,500 footmen, along with the general population of the island. Other sources suggest that the numbers were closer to 100,000 Muslim forces and 4,500 defenders inside the city walls. The most optimistic numbers that I can find suggest 100,000 to 4,500. That's the best that I've seen. And again, this is not necessarily wildly out of line. History is often written by the victors, but these are accounts that are being written by both sides of the conflict. And when the numbers from both sides line up, or at least kind of line up, it starts to make me think that perhaps there's something to them. For those of you who've read the Game of Thrones books, the Siege of Rhodes had a fantastic defense. They actually did do they had a big chain across the harbor that they used to raise and prevent all of the Sultan's ships from sailing into the harbor to be able to defeat or destroy the Hospitaller ships. If you've read Game of Thrones, it's in the books. It's not in the movies or in the TV show. But whether that was inspired by this or inspired by other things, I'm not sure, but I thought it was interesting. So the Siege of Rhodes. Rhodes was defended by a guy named Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam. This is a painted portrait of l'Isle Adam. You'll notice the Maltese cross around his neck in front of his armor. With l'Isle Adam was a guy named Jean Parisot de Valette, who also fought in the defense of Rhodes. We're going to come back to Valette later. Valette was a really, really interesting character who was arguably one of the most influential men in the history of St. John. In late December of 1522, Rhodes fell. There was a peace or an arrangement bartered with the invading Sultan's troops, allowing the entire population or anyone who wanted to, including the knights and their staff and everyone else, to leave on January 1st of 1523, which is what they did. They packed what they could. They got onto the remaining ships that they had left that they defended behind the chain, and they sailed away. And for the second time in 500 years or so, the knights found themselves without an actual place to call home, without a seat of power. They had all these lands everywhere else, but they were all either partially owned lands or within someone else's kingdom. They didn't actually have a place to call home. International operations continued. So within that context, of course, the order did still own lots of property in other places, lots of property around Europe, lots of property throughout Christendom, with varying politics in different places. So keep in mind, 1522, they were defeated. January 1st, 1523, they left. And 1530, 7 years later, they ended up in Malta. Malta, for those of you who don't know where Malta is, you guys can see over on the right-hand side, you can see Jerusalem and Cyprus, and Rhodes isn't labeled, but you can see where the island is. And then Malta is actually so small that it's just a word, and the entire island is behind the first A in Malta in this image. So how did they get to Malta? Well, they spent 7 years running about trying to find different places to have a seat of power again, and with very little luck. Lots of people kind of came up with bad ideas and said, "Oh well, maybe I know a guy who knows." Oh no, that deal fell through, and all that. Until a guy named Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, decided that he was going to gift the entire island of Malta, the archipelago, the 3-island group of Malta, to the Knights Hospitaller. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One is we think that Charles V was probably a bit of a philanthropist and wanted to help them out. Two, it was a great place to put a bunch of Catholic warlike people to help protect the Mediterranean from the Muslim hordes that were trying to come through the Mediterranean and invade Europe and all this sort of thing, right? Maybe not the most philanthropic decision, perhaps a little bit self-serving. this is what Malta looks like. Malta and Gozo. I forget what the name of the little middle island is there. I never went. Malta and Gozo. Valletta, what is now Valletta, is circled in yellow there. And Valletta is very, very important because Valletta is what is now Valletta, is where the knights settled. The country of Malta, most of that little rock in the middle of the Mediterranean is rocky shores, terrible landing sites. There's only really two functional harbors in the whole archipelago. One of them is directly to the south of Valletta. You see a little bay there, and you can see, I don't know if you guys can see it on the internet now, but the little, you can see where there's a beach. And then Valletta itself. And Valletta looks like this. And if any of you have any kind of naval or marine experience, you'll recognize that this is like the ultimate harbor. If you were going to design a harbor yourself, this is what it would probably look like. So at first, when the knights arrived on the island of Malta, they fairly quickly established two forts. The first was Fort St. Angelo, which was really the seat of power, or the seat of their main city, and they built a site called Fort St. Elmo to help defend the entrance to the harbor. This satellite image is clearly, we didn't have satellites in 15 whatever it was, but this is clearly still the geography of the site. So Jean Parisot de Valette, who I was talking about earlier, Jean Parisot de Valette, he was born, he's going to become very important momentarily. He was born on the 4th of February in 1495, and he lasted until 1568. So that made him 73 when he died. Jean Parisot de Valette was a knight of the order. He was part of the Longue of Provence. He was present during the Great Siege of Rhodes in 1522, where he served with distinction. He made quite a name for himself as both a ferocious and very intelligent combatant. He was noted for his exceptionally good strategy and his level-headedness. In 1541, before the events we're going to get to, he was captured by the Turks and actually spent a year as a galley slave rowing a Turkish galley before being freed during a prisoner exchange in 1542. 2 years later, he was elected captain of the galleys, and that doesn't mean captain of a galley. That means the guy in charge of all of the galleys for the Order of St. John. And then 13 years after that, he was elected Grand Master of the Order. Valette was a really incredible person. We're going to talk a little bit more about him moving forward here, but it's difficult to emphasize reading the accounts of what this guy was like. Difficult to emphasize how highly regarded and highly respected both he was by his troops and by his population, but also just in terms of his absolute competence and leadership. He is very highly regarded by everyone, including the sultans and caliphs who were fighting against him. In 1565, he led the defense of Malta, which is what we're going to talk about next. So in 1565 was the siege of Malta. Once again, the Muslims were fed up with the Christians, wanted to have the Mediterranean back, and so we're going to lay siege to Malta this time. It's where the knights are now. We've been trying to kill them for 540 years, and it hasn't worked yet. We're going to try one more time. So the siege of Malta was one of the greatest sieges, arguably greatest sieges in military history. The Hospitallers at the time were led by Jean de Valette. He'd been in power as the Grand Master for about 8 years, so enough time to settle into the role. And they did have a couple of years heads up on the siege of Malta. They did have an awareness that this was coming. Through spies, through paid informants who would tell them that in Istanbul they're building a massive fleet. Everyone says it's going to Malta. There was some lead up to this, so there were preparations that were made. You can see in this illustration. I hope you can see in this illustration. If you just rotate that 90 degrees clockwise, let's put it that way for you guys. You can see this is a fairly clear depiction of the harbor. At what is now Valletta. The Turks were led by Mustafa Pasha and the Corsair Dragut. Dragut was a ferocious barbarian. Mustafa Pasha was the leader, and Dragut was the military leader. So the siege of Malta was notable. It lasted for, I forget, it was like 8 months or something like that. But the siege of Malta was notable for a few things, in particular, great heroics. If you go and read accounts, and there's actually, I got it. I've got this that I've only read bits and pieces of so far by Francesco Balbi de Correggio, but this guy actually kept a diary as a combatant in the siege of Malta, and writes about his experiences being under siege. It's been obviously translated into English, but it's pretty incredible stuff. The stories that came out of this event were really, truly remarkable. So, at one point when Fort St. Elmo, that harbor guardian fort, finally fell, the last two knights that defended Juan de Graça and Juan de Miranda were so weakened that they commanded their pages to place them into chairs and sit their chairs in the breaches of the walls so they could fight to the death when they were no longer able to stand on their own anymore. And they actually sat there in chairs swinging their swords at everyone who came through the breaches in the walls at Fort St. Elmo right before Fort St. Elmo fell. And I can't, to me, that's a really compelling image to see these two guys just sitting there waiting for death, but refusing to give up, refusing to evacuate with everyone else. Is quite remarkable. There's a bridge of sunken ships, and I'm gonna, if you look where Fort St. Angelo is, the next finger of land just down from Fort St. Angelo, just south of Fort St. Angelo, was a secondary fort during the siege. And when they couldn't actually resupply because their Turkish troops had cut off their ability to move down inland, over, and then back up, they actually took a bunch of their remaining ships and sank them in a line across the bay, building a bridge out of sunken ships so that they could resupply themselves at Fort St. Angelo. Jean de La Valette, at the age of 71, personally led sorties out of what is now Vittoriosa to personally fight the Turks because he thought that this was going to be a good way to inspire his troops. One of the most notable things is that, and there's a fair degree of corroboration on this, is that there were, in terms of numbers of combatants, there were fewer combatants than at Rhodes. There were about 40,000 Turks and 7,000, not 7,000 knights, but 7,000 knights and defenders. And I should probably amend that bullet point there. There are only a few hundred knights, but then they would have their staff and their other foot soldiers and the other people who were fighting along with them. So about 4-to-1, which is not a terrible ratio in terms of medieval sieges, except the Turks lost 90% of their force. The Hospitallers had 6,000 wounded, so they killed about 6 people for every one that they had wounded or dead. On Malta, after and I'm going to go back here, I should put another slide in about this, but where Fort St. Angelo is, the siege of Malta ended in 1565. The Turks were driven back. And because of the incredible odds that the Hospitallers were successful against, what was Fort St. Angelo became known as Vittoriosa, the victorious city. Some people call it the unconquerable city. It's interesting to note that in the history of Malta, Malta's been besieged at least 6 or 7 times, including during World War II for a period of time, and Vittoriosa has still never actually fallen. It's an incredibly fortified place, and I wish I'd had time to get some photos out for you guys for this, but it's difficult to emphasize how well fortified it is. Sorry, I'm using my space bar. I'm not supposed to use my space bar. So where the large stick of land in the middle of the harbor where Fort St. Elmo was built on the end of, that turned into, or was later turned into, Valletta, named for Jean de Valette, the capital city of Malta. It's still there today. It's still the seat of the presidency of the European Union. And then within the city of Valletta, of course, one of the first things to be built was a hospital, the Sacred Infirmary, the Sacra Infermeria. And the Sacred Infirmary was notable for a few things. Construction began a few years after the siege. It began in 1574. It's been expanded multiple times over the years. It currently sits at 155 meters in length, making it the largest single hospital ward, I believe, in the world. certainly in Europe and certainly at the time, and I think it still holds the record for the longest, largest hospital ward on the planet. It could hold 914 patients in the upper hall, and probably as many again or more in the lower halls. And the lower halls were the similar size and length to this. It's interesting to note as well that the Sacra Infermeria was notable for pioneering a number of medical techniques, including the first ever personal toilets for each person. They figured out that one of the best ways to control cholera and dysentery was to stop people from sharing toilet facilities. So there are actually private toilet nooks for each bed along the way here. While at the Sacra Infermeria, I've read some accounts, and I don't have the reference handy, that this was one of the first places that we started pioneering the use of metal, silverware, and flatware for dinner service, because we realized, the hospitals realized, that they were actually antimicrobial. They might not have understood germ theory, but they knew if you ate off silver, you were way less likely to get sick than if you ate off china or wood. Keep in mind, a lot of stuff would have been made of wood back then as well, right? So the Sacra Infermeria stayed in use really until the 20th century. It was used during World War I by the British. That's why we have a photograph of it here. Still in use as a hospital. And I can't think of many hospitals that are being built today that are still in use 450 years or 350, 400 years after they've been constructed. Oddly enough, after World War I, maybe even World War II, it was converted into a conference center that's attached to it. The hall itself is still in one piece, but they built a conference center and attached to this, and the Sacra Infermeria now serves as a glorious banquet hall and the like. And it was the location of the Malta summit where President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev declared an end to the Cold War and actually signed the documents, one room over from this. It's just a quick view of Malta from the ocean side. And again, I wish I could point with this, but you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is dated to 1801, so 300 years later, but the geography still hasn't changed. To the right, you can see where Fort St. Elmo is. And then if you count the middle finger of land over on the left, that sort of has like a big blocky square structure right on the end of it, that's Fort St. Angelo, with Vittorioso, the victorious city, just farther off to the edge of the frame there. So after the Great Siege, the Knights continued to develop military power and continued to develop naval power in the Mediterranean. Oh, I see someone squiggling red lines. I'm going to blame Anna for that. I'm going to annotate and erase. So the Hospitallers continued to develop their naval power throughout the 1600s. At some point, starting around the 1600s, they started to decline a little bit. So in the 1600s, 1656, we have the Battle of the Dardanelles, where a great fleet comes over and again fights the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, who were over at that time. Oh, David says, my mouse shows up on the screen when I use it. Unfortunately, Dave, my mouse does not show up on my screen when I use it. It only shows up on your screen, which makes it very difficult for me to know what I'm pointing at. But thank you for the heads up. So 1656, the Battle of the Dardanelles, not a significant conflict in this story, but just an example of the ongoing naval conflict around the Mediterranean. Starting around the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, the order started to decline. They started to become, as one historian put it, fat and lazy and complacent. The threat from the Muslim Empire was diminishing over time as the structure of naval power and military conflict changed. And so there was less impetus for them to maintain their defenses, for them to maintain their naval power. They were quite wealthy at this point, so they sort of sat back on their laurels and just existed as investment bankers. So in 1798, and I don't know, this is unfortunately the best image that I could get of this, but in 1798, the French expeditionary force was on their way to Egypt. Napoleon had heard about the Sphinx and wanted to knock its nose off. I don't think that's true, but they certainly did do that. But Napoleon and the French Expeditionary Force were on the way to Egypt, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, and their first conquest was Malta. So they stopped in at Malta for fresh water, and they said to, at the time, the Grand Master, we want to sail our entire fleet into your harbor so we can take on fresh water. And the Grand Master responded, you can't do that. You can only bring in 2 ships at a time. And the French said, okay, we're just going to kill everyone and take the whole island ourselves instead. To which the Knights Hospitaller, who had really lost their fighting edge over the last 150 years, really didn't put up much of a fight. There were a couple of little skirmishes. I think a few dozen people died, and Napoleon conquered Malta. In 1798, the Knights were again stuck on their ships, told to leave, go back to from whence you came, and get out of Malta. And this is what's called a stock image that I forgot to put an image in with, so I apologize for this. I think this is actually from either Iceland or Scotland. This has nothing to do with the presentation at all. I just forgot to put a proper graphic in this slide. So the order was kicked out of Malta, and all of the different longs, the members of the different longs from all their different countries, largely returned to their home countries. And the effect of that was that these knights all went back to about 8 or 9 different places, 7 or 8 different places. One of the most notable places that they went back to, and it's important for a number of reasons, was Russia. And in Russia, one of the Tsars, I forget which one, I'm sorry, I don't have it handy, decided that he was going to recognize a guy named Tamasi as the Grand Master of the Order, and tried to keep the order alive in Russia by supporting them. Unfortunately, Tamasi died in 1805, and a lot of what was the imperial order in Russia died with him. Many other knights returned to their home longs to form splinter groups, and we're going to talk about why that's important in a sec. The short version is that the Order of the Hospital, broadly speaking, was unable to find a single land to call home and remained scattered, and we're still scattered today. 222 years later, there is still no definitive place for the Order of the Hospital to call home. It kind of is. So, rebirth. So what happened after all this Russian stuff in the diaspora? Well, a bunch of the knights who had come from Italy ended up, of course, back in Rome. It's where all roads lead to. Hey, see what I did there? And a bunch of the knights returned back to Rome. And in 1879, the Grand Mastership of the Order was restored by Pope Leo XIII in the form of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta still exists today. They still do a large amount of good work around the world. And they are, by virtue of being Catholic, they are realistically the true successors or true heirs to the title of the Knights Hospitaller, true descendants of the Knights Hospitaller. The knights who returned to Rome were at some point, I don't have a date on this, were gifted a palace, the Palazzo di Malta, by one of their members who was quite wealthy. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, as recognized by the Pope, does maintain what's called non-territorial sovereignty, which means they actually claim to be a nation. They are recognized as a nation. The United Nations actually gives them observer status and recognizes them as a nation without a physical territory to belong to. They do have passports, they have currency, and you can be a citizen. The citizenship is very limited to high-ranking members of the order, but they are very, very much an extant organization that still does a lot of good work today. You could really think of them, in a lot of what they do, as the medical arm of the Catholic Church, and they actually operate a number of things, from air evacuation services throughout Africa to a 28-car hospital train that travels around Europe and goes to disasters, which I only just learned about today, but there you go. The knights who went back to Germany were reestablished by Frederick Wilhelm IV as the Johanniter Orden, who are still in existence today. I don't have a date on when they were reestablished by Frederick Wilhelm IV, but they were reestablished as the Johanniter Orden, the Order of St. John, the Order of the Johanniters. The Catholic branch, the Catholic Church specific branch of those knights, became the Malteser, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Malteser Hilfsdienst, who apparently still do things, still do nonprofit medical work, and had notable service in Vietnam, providing medical service to the Vietnamese people. A number of them were killed. A number of them were held as non-combatant POWs by the Viet Cong and tortured and murdered and all that sort of horrible stuff. So that's where the German law went. Which brings us sort of to us, the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. And where did we come from? Well, our group, what is now our group, is the group of knights that were from, oddly enough, and I don't quite understand this well enough, but a group of knights from France, Auvergne, and Provence acted without authority from the church, and reconstituted the English long in 1831. I don't know why they were a bunch of the knights from France. I haven't been able to find a good answer to that. But they went on to reform. They met in France, and they decided to reform the English long. They moved back to England with it, and eventually got recognized by a royal charter of Queen Victoria in 1888. I'll talk about that more in a sec. The end result was that the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, at the time, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, was reformed in England at a time when the Commonwealth was really taking off, and was spread basically throughout the Commonwealth, becoming what we now know today as the Most Venerable Order. So the modern order, again, Queen Victoria recognized the Order of St. John with a royal charter in 1888. Oops. That was supposed to come up with each individual bullet point. I apologize. So the Most Venerable Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem is a royal order of chivalry. That means it is a way to obtain a knighthood if you want, if you do enough good work, hard enough, long enough, strong enough. The monarch of the British realm, currently Queen Elizabeth II, is the sovereign head of the order. The monarch's representatives or designates, so in Canada, that's the Governor General and the Lieutenant Governor of each province. The stated goal of the organization is to prevent and relieve sickness and injury, and to act to enhance the health and well-being of people anywhere in the world, which is obviously a goal that's fairly familiar to all of us, I think. And I'm hearing a lot of noise. I'm not sure what's going on outside. The Most Venerable Order operates organizations around the world to further that goal. We'll talk about those in a sec. So of those organizations around the world, there's the St. John Eye Hospital, which this is a picture of, back in 1882 being built. So the St. John Eye Hospital was originally built on Bethlehem Street on Mount Zion in Jerusalem to provide ophthalmic services and ophthalmic care to people in the Holy Land who were unable to, without consideration for their ability to pay. So to provide care to anyone and everyone who needed it. And now operates multiple sites throughout occupied Palestine, throughout Israel, throughout whatever you want to refer to those lands as. I believe there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 or 10 out clinics now that operate throughout that area and provide tens of thousands of people with their only source of ophthalmic care. They do include, or that the eye hospital does include, a clinic on Morristown Street in the Old City, built directly on the site of the first hospital, on the very cobblestones that Gerard used to walk up and down nearly 1,000 years ago. It was neat. I was able to visit Morristown Street again 3 years ago or so, 3.5 years ago, and there's actually outside the hospital, there is actually a little plaque set in the cobblestones saying there are the original cobblestones dating back to Roman times, which means they're actually the original stones that Gerard would have walked to and from work, or to and from the well or market or whatever when he was doing his work there. It's a pretty remarkable piece of history. There is a little plaque, a large plaque placed on the site of the first hospital. Right. So what else did St. John do? Well, we've been very active in the wars. St. John Ambulance provided a lot of service for the Allies in World War I and World War II. I don't know, but I would assume that there were probably Johanna or Orden doing the similar good work on the German side, but I don't know that. We have provided doctors, nurses, and field medics. In World War I, we saw 1,077 members killed, including a member of one of our Victoria divisions. We'll talk about her in a second. We did provide along with all of the actual service that we provided throughout the wars. We did a lot of fundraising. We did a lot of first aid training. We did a lot of trying to get money to raise funds for medical supplies to go to places. So as you can see, these are some of the old posters from back in the World War II, or the first two posters are World War II era, and the last posters, I believe, 1950s, something like that. Those of you who were attached to Division 176 in Victoria might recognize it. You know, at the top there is an ink drawing commemorating our that'd be our 815th anniversary, and suggesting that people would be well advised to help the order because we provide battlefield care. You know, below we see serving humanity for over 800 years. I believe that's from the 50s or the 60s, post World War II, but you know, obviously a Crusader motif and a modern motif. To the right is a piece of art by a woman named Doris Zinkaisen, who was an artist attached to some of the Allied forces who were liberating parts of Germany and Poland. And this painting is called Human Laundry, and depicts a number of our St. John members providing care during the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on April 1st of 1945. We did operate a field hospital in Etaples in France during World War I. The hospital was bombed on several occasions. A number of our members lost their lives there, particularly nurses. I'm not sure, I think there were probably a couple of male members as well, but a large number of the female nursing contingent were killed. I mentioned earlier one of our members from Victoria, a lady named Dorothy Pearson Twist. Dorothy was a member of St. John Ambulance Nursing Division 34 in Victoria. She volunteered with a voluntary aid detachment, meaning she wasn't really getting paid. She went over to serve in World War II, part of World War I. At the age of 28, when she first went over, she died 5 years later in 1918 at the age of 33 of pneumonia at the French and Hill Military Hospital in England. She'd been there for just over 1 month before she fell ill and died. I have no way to prove it. I don't think anyone has a way to prove it, but that is a bit of a suspicious date for her to have actually died of Spanish flu. Certainly the time that the Spanish flu pandemic was running around that part of the world, so it's not unreasonable to think that that's what she was. That's what killed her. She was from Shawnigan Lake originally. She worked for the Canadian Imperial Bank here in Victoria, and hers is the only female name on the cenotaph in Cobble Hill. If you ever get a chance to go up to the cenotaph in Cobble Hill, go find Dorothy Twist's name, and think that she was with us over 100 years ago. Other things that St. John does here in Canada: we do first aid to the injured. We have a book and a training program. For the longest time, you would do, instead of doing a standard first aid course, you would do a first aid to the injured course. The certificate here is my mom's from 1961. First Aid to the Injured was a first aid textbook. We pioneered in a lot of ways the concept of first aid. It kind of existed beforehand, but St. John really popularized the concept. Starting in the late 1800s, along with railways and railroads and the tail end of the Industrial Revolution, and everyone's working in factories, and so people are getting injured by power tools and steam tools and all this sort of stuff, and nobody knew how to help them. And so we started publishing First Aid to the Injured to teach people how to care for injured casualties before they could be gotten to a doctor. So focused a lot on industrial first aid. Published many books. I collect First Aid to the Injured books. There's literally dozens of editions of the same book. It's fascinating to read, to see how things changed over the years. The Order of St. John operates many international programs. I'm not going to read off this list, but this is a list of all of the countries in the world that the Order of St. John currently operates in, and the role that we take on in different countries varies greatly. Here in Canada, we teach first aid to the public. We have a therapy dog program. We have a youth cadet leadership program. We have an adult medical first responder program, which all of you are familiar with. And we sort of generally try to support good causes relating to the health and wellness and care of Canadians. In other places, we operate entire ambulance services. We operate national ambulance services. We operate national auxiliary ambulance services. We operate air evacuation services. In other places, we just have a little first aid post here and there. Some places that you might recognize St. John from globally in the last, these are all examples taken from the last year. The White Island volcanic eruption in New Zealand, right? This is an ambulance taking some of the first casualties from that to hospital. For those of you who have been following the COVID-19 crisis, NHS Nightingale Hospital has over 1,000 St. John volunteers who have signed up to help provide care at NHS Nightingale should they be needed. I don't believe they're taking many patients right now. There's a limited capacity, but we do have a large contingent there. The Hong Kong democracy protests and those famous photos or videos of the crowds parting to let ambulances through, well, you'll see a very familiar white cross on the side of them. The Australian wildfires. So in Canada, a little bit of a history here. The first, I think you guys probably know a lot of this because it's covered in a lot of the material that we have for St. John. But in 1882, the first aid course was held in Quebec. You'll notice this is before we got a royal charter from Queen Victoria. In 1895, the St. John Ambulance Association was formed in Canada. In 1909, the first what was called at the time a brigade, and we still kind of use the brigade nomenclature a little bit, was formed in Forest City, Ontario. It's interesting to note that as I was prepping this just like half an hour before, and I didn't have an opportunity to dig through this more, but there are references in one of my source books saying that as early as 1794, an excavation in Montreal uncovered an 8-pointed white Maltese cross that appeared to have come over with someone of significance significantly before 1794. So there are archaeological indications that the Knights Hospitaller had in fact come to the New World, come to Canada, significantly earlier than this. They just hadn't actually established an organization. It's a very credible thing to think. I don't know more about it to tell you more about it tonight, unfortunately. Our official goal is to enable Canadians to improve their health and safety and quality of life by providing training and community service. That is the de facto goal of the organization. So what do we do here in Victoria? Well, we do community events. You might recognize our superintendent right here looking very happy in front of the Parliament buildings. We do mass gathering events. This is I believe the Symphony Splash 3 or 4 years ago, I think, where we go down and provide first aid services to crowds of 50, 60,000 people. Clearly not going to happen this year, unfortunately. We're very sad about that. I wanted to finish as my last slide, second to last slide, with this passage. And this was actually one of the vows that was, or one of the, I don't know what the right word is. One of the explanations that was provided to members or potential members of the organization back into the 14th century. And it's obviously, again, been translated to English. This is the original version is in Latin and it was translated to French and English. But it really strikes me as being still quite valid. It says, "Good friend, you desire the company of the house and you're right in this. For many gentlemen earnestly request the reception of their children or their friends and are most joyful when they can place them in this order. And if you are willing to be in so excellent and so honorable a company and so holy an order as that of the hospital, you are right in this." It's very boilerplate line. Says, "Hey, we're really good. Your friends have told us we're really good. It's a good idea to come and join us." And it goes on, it says, "But if it's because you see us well clothed, riding on great chargers and having everything for our comfort, then you are misled. For when you would desire to eat, it will be necessary for you to fast. And when you would wish to fast, then you will have to eat. And when you would desire to sleep, it will be necessary for you to keep watch. And when you would like to stand on watch, you will have to sleep. and you will be sent this side of the sea and beyond into places which will not please you, and you will have to go there. It will be necessary for you, therefore, to abandon all your desires to fulfill those of another and to endure other hardships in the order more than I can describe to you. Are you willing to suffer all these things? And this is really interesting to me. I mean, this basically says, if you want to come and join us because you see us being really wealthy, which the order at the time was, make sure you understand what you're signing up for, because there's a lot of hard work that has to go into this as well. You'll have to give up a lot. You're going to have to work hard to be able to do this. And these last two paragraphs really do actually strike very true to me, because and I know there's a number of people who are paramedics and other professionals in healthcare, you know, who this is still basically my job description when I go to work. Like, there are literally days where I've, you know, this is what I do when I go to work, and this is 700 plus years old, and it hasn't really changed that much. 800 plus years old, pardon me. That's it, folks. I don't have too much else. I'm sure I've yammered at you a lot. I was hoping for an hour to an hour and a half. I hit an hour 25, so I'm not terribly upset about that. For those of you really fast who are interested, sjvicbc.ca is our website for the Victoria division. If anyone wants to go and check us out there, you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at sjvicbc. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Anna to maybe curate some questions and let me know what I can answer for folks.
Okay. 1 second. I have to minimize some of my screens because I don't see what I'm doing. Okay. So
I'm just going to scroll through a bunch of the references just so they're available for people seeing the recording later.
So the question that just got posted is, what does the Latin motto mean?
Oh, great question. I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. I thought everyone knew that one. Pro fide pro utilitate hominum. Pro fide, for the faith. Pro utilitate hominum. Directly translated, for the service of mankind. I believe we're using a more contemporary translation saying for the service of humanity now. But for the faith and for the service of humanity, or for the faith and in the service of humanity.
Okay, there were a few more questions. Was there a single Grandmaster at any time, or was this a title that several people carried?
Oh, pardon me. No, the Grandmaster, there's only been one at a time until after 1798, and I think there might have been a couple of points when the order's fragmented, where there might have been different people trying to be the Grandmaster, the leader of their particular splinter groups at the same time. But certainly while the order was a whole entity, there's only been one Grandmaster at a time. It is the person in charge.
Here's a question. Any idea when women or females first got involved?
I don't have a direct answer for you. I mean, one of our early slides in this was from 1204, so very early in the organization's history, of nuns of the Order of St. John in England, and there are written records of female members very early on. I couldn't put an actual hard date on it for you, but sorry, I'm getting cheeky texts from Michael right now as well. Yeah, I couldn't put a date on it for you. I mean, certainly 1204, we have direct documented references. Something that, and I don't have it handy, unfortunately. I looked at this the other day and I don't think I kept it out. We actually had, going back as early as the 1700s, written documentation of open acceptance of non-binary gendered individuals, and how we actually definitively delineated providing respectful interactions with people who were not either identifying as male or female, which is another really fascinating rabbit hole to go down. But that was back in the 1700s. In terms of women joining, do so. Valentine says behave. Um, but in terms of women, 1204 is the earliest one that I know off the top of my head. I expect earlier. Most of the Catholic orders had some type of female involvement, whether it was in the form of nuns or something else, uh, in some way, shape, or form. So
Cool. Next, it's not really a question, but a pretty interesting comment. I don't know if everyone was following the chat log here, so I'll read this one out because it's a super interesting family connection. Someone, username Nicole, I'm sorry, I don't know which division you belong to, Nicole, but she writes that her relative Pedro Del Monte was part of the order and part of the siege of Rhodes when he was 23. He survived and later went to Malta, and he was the Grand Master after Jean Parisot. So that's a pretty cool little, oh, Division 518. She's from
we met
518.
Nicole. We talked to her at the start of this. We talked to her at the start.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Webcam's off.
Friar Pierre Del Monte from 1568 to 1572. There you go.
There you go.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant. That's really cool that you have your family history back that far. I would love to talk more about that at some point. That's amazing.
There was a comment that some of the history stuff states that the 1st Brigade was in London, Ontario, and not the one that you posted, and apparently they're division number 1.
I got to go back to my slide here because this is my notes.
1909 Forest
1909 Forest Brigade. So that piece of information is coming from this book, The Maple Leaf and the White Cross, which was published about 8 years ago or so. And it actually addresses that in here. And I'm not gonna, it'll take me 5 minutes to dig it up, but they did actually reference that there was some misunderstandings about what the 1st Brigades were. And there was actually at least 1 or 2 brigades that weren't official brigades. They were just a bunch of guys who happened to be involved with St. John back in England or back in the old country. And when they got to Canada, they just fired up their own thing and did their own thing. That might be where the incongruence there is, or it might be something different. I'm not sure. I would have to go and do a little bit of reading and digging and stuff to really give you a good answer on
that. Another question is, can you speak a bit about the relationship between the order and us brigade level folks?
I'm not sure what to speak about there. I mean, the order is the overarching international organization, or order, the international overarching order, whose members provide the structure for brigade things to happen. So depending on which brigade you're at, there's a reasonably good likelihood that you have a number of members of the order attached to or involved with your brigade, whether they're actually boots on the ground members or whether they're part of the executive group, certainly helping operate things at provincial headquarters over in Vancouver. Certainly here in Victoria, we've got, I'm not going to speculate or try and count, but we've got a number of members of the order directly involved at the local level. So in terms of what the relationship is, the order is the bigger group that works to make things like brigade happen, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers the question or not, or if there's more clarification I can
add. There's just a note here that brigade refers to St. John as a whole, and divisions are local and specific to whatever town they're in.
I've heard a couple of different things, and I understand the provincial commissioners listening right now. So please correct me, Dave, if I've got anything wrong here. but my understanding is that we used to talk about brigade as sort of an organized units of people that would go and do things, and the broader brigade was the whole organization of people who would organize and go and do things, and that we're slowly moving away from the nomenclature of brigade and just talking about divisions now instead. You know, and certainly St. John as a whole does encompass things that aren't necessarily brigade as well. You know, in terms of you know, first aid provision, and I mean the cadets were brigades. I don't know if the therapy dogs ever used the brigade name or not. I don't think they did, but I could be mistaken on that. But that's my understanding. But again, please someone correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, if anybody has a comment, now's the time when you can unmute yourself and speak more freely.
In Canada is at the provincial level. There are 4 brigades across Canada right now, I believe. And our brigade is the province of British Columbia. There's a brigade in Alberta that's quite small, a large brigade in Ontario, and a small brigade in Quebec. And we're not sure if the brigade in Nova Scotia is still active.
Thank you, Dave. That was Provincial Commissioner Dave Valentine talking, I believe.
There's a question here. Sorry, I've scrolled past it. Do you know when the name Knights of St. John became official?
Well, technically, that's a good question, because I'm not sure if the Knights of St. John has ever been official in the sense that I don't know who would make it official. It's not the name that's used right now, but it's a name that's used commonly to talk about the division, or pardon me, to talk about the organization. You know, I mean, certainly as early as back in the early Jerusalem days, the St. John nomenclature, and I should have had this on a slide, I'm sorry I didn't. The Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, the name came about, there's a few different versions of why, but they're all very similar in that the hospital was either directly across the street from, very close to, or directly funded by a local church of St. John the Baptist. And so we became the hospital, the St. John Hospital, the hospital beside St. John. So that's the prevailing wisdom in terms of when, you know, calling them the Knights of St. John. You know, the knighthoods would have started happening, I would imagine, sometime fairly shortly after the recognition by papal bull. Certainly in terms of developing, as the military forces developed, it wouldn't take very long, I expect, for people to start having the title and status of knights. In terms of you know, referring to the broader organization as the Knights of St. John, you know, the Knights Hospitaller, yeah, sometime in the 1200s, I'd imagine, maybe earlier.
There's just a comment from Rosalie to the point before. She says she doesn't think that brigade in Nova Scotia is still active. They're called VMR now. I'm assuming that's something like volunteer medical responders.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of, BC is kind of the bastion of tradition when it comes to that paramilitary stuff. Out in Ontario, they're more calling themselves St. John Medical First Responders. There's no ambulance, there's no brigade. So
I'm gonna keep asking questions. I'm just gonna pull up an image here that I want people to see as well. So speaking of being last bastions, I don't know if you guys can see this or not. Is my screen still sharing with my browser tab open?
yeah.
So if you look at this, this is a hospital. This is a photo of one of the staff members at the St. John Eye Hospital in Jerusalem. And if you look at their uniforms and look at those epaulets, right? You'll notice that even within the hospital, the care aides are given 1 star, the nursing unit chiefs are given 3 pips. Um, we might be the last bastion in Canada. I got to go and visit the hospital and take a tour a few years ago, and they're still very much involved in that uniformed rank structure there, at least. So.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, I know Alberta has kind of gotten rid of uniforms and they're doing their thing in a different way. But anyhow, there's a question here. Is the order non-denominational, even with respect to other religions?
Yes and no. I believe the official language, if I recall correctly, is that the order celebrates its Christian roots and values, but welcomes people of any denomination or faith. And what that is that the most venerable order of the, and I should clarify here, the most venerable order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, the Commonwealth and British tradition that was Protestant for a long time, is secular now, is non-denominational, so anyone can be a member regardless of their faith, if they're doing good work and pursuing the values that are rooted in Christianity. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and I'm not sure about the other allied orders. Certainly the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is definitively a Catholic organization, not just Christian, but you must be Catholic to be a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta.
Good. I have no more questions in this chat at the moment, but if anybody has anything, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Other than that, thanks for putting this on, Nick. Oh, here we go. There is a Catholic arm of the order. It's called something like the Hospitaller Order of St. John.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different, I'd be surprised if that's a subset of the most venerable order. So after the organization split in 1798, there's much mayhem, much confusion, much disorganization. What we are here in Canada, and specifically not just in Canada, because there's multiple branches of the descendant organizations that trace their lineage back to the Knights Hospitaller that operate here in Canada. Those of us who do St. John ambulance work, who are brigade medical first responders and who do train first aid, do therapy dog stuff and all that, we're from the most venerable order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, which is specifically the secular, non-denominational Christian heritage group that is led by the Queen of England. There are absolutely other groups of St. John descendant organizations. Some of them are recognized. There's actually something called the Grand Council of the Orders of St. John, and there are 5 recognized descendant orders that can directly trace their lineage back to the true Knights Hospitaller. And then there's a bunch of other organizations that literally sprung up and tried to use the order's name. Some of them with varying degrees of legitimacy or not. But anything outside those 5 orders recognized by the Great Council of the Orders of St. John is not officially recognized. And the Sovereign Military Order is one of them. The most venerable order of the hospital is one of them. The Dutch, the Swedes, the Johanniter Orden, and then there's a second German order, I think. Oh, I'm going to feel really bad if I can't remember all 5 of these. I think that's it. But if it's outside of those 5 orders, those are the officially recognized orders of St. John within the Great Council, and outside of that,
here somewhere.
There's a bunch of other stuff as well. Or do you have
the Order of St. John, the Order of Malta, the Johanniter Orden, the Crown Order of St. John in the Netherlands, and the Crown Order of St. John in Sweden.
There you go. So outside of those, there might be Catholic groups. Like there's a branch of the stonemasons who profess to be. They use a Maltese cross. They profess to be some sort of Knights of St. John. They're not recognized by the Great Council, and what their lineage directly back to the order is I have no idea. I can't speak with any degree of authority on that, but that's one example of things. The Order of St. Lazarus as well also does similar stuff, where they profess to have a great history and use the Maltese cross, except in vermilion green. And they're not part of the Great Council, the Orders of St. John, that directly trace their lineage back to the Knights Hospitaller in Malta and Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. There's just comments about the order in the States and how it's a totally different organization that doesn't do what we do here. They mostly fundraise, but
Yeah.
there still is an order.
Yes. So they are, believe it or not, they are, at least if it's the same, there might be more than one Order of St. John in the US, but there is an international, the St. John International Organization, which is the foundation run by the order, does have a recognized presence in the States, whose primary goal is to fundraise and to provide services for, to provide fundraising services for St. John International. Where we work, Americas, and they're in the USA. And there you can see what the St. John International folks did. And you'll see they're wearing the actual true order white cross on a red background. And if I had to guess, they look like they're doing, I feel like they do veteran services. Incorporated in 1957 for the purpose of supporting the St. John Eye Hospital, made a priory in 96, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, based in Washington, D.C. Oh yeah, there you go. They partnered with the Department of Veterans Affairs, where members can volunteer in support of military veterans and activities like wheelchair regatta and such. So certainly a very, very different thing than what we do here in Canada. But again, if you go to New Zealand, we operate the ambulance services we do in Kenya and Malaysia and Hong Kong. The same organization having very, very, very different roles in different parts of the world in different countries.
There's just some comments about the Red Cross. Hold on, let me scroll back up. Someone says that the Red Cross sometimes tries to take credit for our service in the Crusades, which claim that our knights were their knights. My only comment is that the Red Cross is a far more modern organization than we are.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I've seen, and this frustrates me a little bit, because at the end of the day, the Red Cross is a great organization that does really great work, and St. John is a great organization that really does great work. And for us to get into these, it's not pedantic, but it just gets to be very frustrating, because it detracts from the mission of both organizations. Did people wear red crosses in battle during the Crusades? Yes, the Templars did that. Was there a red cross on a white background in the Crusades? Yes, the Templars were doing that. Was that the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross? No. I believe they have their roots back in the 1800s somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's 1863 or something like that they were formed.
You can then argue that the International Committee of the Red Cross was founded before the modern Most Venerable Order of St. John received royal charter, but we have this history going back to the Crusades. It turns into this big thing, and at the end of the day, you know what? We both have organizations that are here to help people, so let's try and do that. And if they want to, I don't know, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And during the wars, we did a lot of work with the Red Cross, the Joint War Organization. My understanding is there was a lot of fundraising and stuff done, first aid supplies, volunteers sent. And if you look at posters from that era, it'll often show a figure wearing a red cross and a figure wearing a Maltese cross. So, and there are medals from that time showing both of our coats of arms and logos. So
yeah, like even here, the farthest left poster, give all you can, with Red Cross and St. John. Like we've got a long history of working hand in hand with them, and some people find anything to fight about. I don't think that's something worth fighting about.
Yeah, we were there first.
Anything else, folks? Are you done? Is everyone tired of hearing me talk yet?
I just have a comment from Michael on my phone here. Note that the brigade side of the order under Sir John Furley was a response to the Red Cross refusing to enter a battlefield not under truce.
I didn't know that, but sure, I believe you. I also see a question from Mike Hoskinson here. If you had $500 to donate, would you choose St. John Ambulance or the Red Cross? Well, I would personally choose St. John. Whether I would direct that donation locally, provincially, or internationally is another question. I will say that after spending time in Israel and the Palestinian territories, I do make a monthly donation, or Anna and I do actually, technically, to the eye hospital to the tune of about $50 a month. And I believe when we add up all the different brigade members that we have here, we're donating something like $2,500 a year to the eye hospital, at least the last time I checked, which was about a year ago. So.
I think that's it for
Thanks,
questions.
Nick.
People are kind of saying thank you. So next week, if you guys tune in, we will be covering allergies and anaphylaxis. We're kind of returning to our regularly scheduled MFR content. So next week, allergies and anaphylaxis. After that, I believe, I don't know if we've confirmed Andrew Guy or
we have Doctors Guy and Brophy have indicated that they're very interested in teaching in the next few weeks. The specific topic and which dates they're going to be teaching on are still not quite set in stone yet, but you can expect a couple of our physician members in the weeks after Dave.
Okay, so tune in next week. I will send out the invitation pretty shortly, and we're also posting these to a YouTube channel. So we've got the first two up. You can watch last week's with Dr. John Wallace and the week before that with Nick when he talked about sepsis. Yeah, so if you miss them, you want to watch them. If you want to rewatch them, they will be posted as we go.
I'll suggest if anyone wants the links, if you didn't get them, I think they've already been sent out in the last email for the last couple of presentations. If you want to reach out on social media or via email, we can set up a little email list and just keep everyone who wants the links to these Zoom sessions. We can send those out to you and stuff. The videos that are getting posted are unlisted YouTube videos, which means anyone who has the URL can see them, but you can't search for them. So you would need to ask one of us to get the link. So just reach out, SJAVicBC on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or send email to myself or Anna if you have the email addresses.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for presenting, Nick. That was a super informative and fascinating talk. I think this was our best attended video lesson so far. We had 34 people, so that's awesome. And there's quite a few names from divisions elsewhere, so I'm thrilled to see that. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. Tune in next week and have a good evening.
Fantastic.
All right, I will end this meeting for everybody. Good night, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Have a good night.